Okay, well, it is noon. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm Chris Blanke with Four Corners Health Department, and Sarah and Kettle Hake and Angel Dale are also hosting this webinar today. Thank you for joining us with this webinar, Techniques in Connecting with the Tweenager in Crisis. We are taking attendance for certificate and CEU purposes, so please sign in on the Google Doc. Angel Dale has just posted the link for that in the chat box. She's also given a reminder to update your name on for your picture as the participant, so we have an accurate record of who is participating today. Watch for an email after the workshop for slide notes and attestation form and evaluation. And one CEU is offered for LMHPs. Those who want CEUs need to attend the full webinar and complete the attestation form. Four Corners, the reason why we're hosting this workshop for a variety of reasons, but one is very focused on our work with youth mental health. It's a result of a grant that we have through the state, the Maternal Child Health grant, and the state did an assessment that found there needed to be an intentional mental health focus on our youth, especially 10 to 19 years old, and preventing their death by suicide. Locally, we are working with many partners to have a more comprehensive approach to addressing youth mental health needs. We're grateful for the Title 5 maternal child health block grant funds that enable us to provide this education today. We're very grateful to Dr. Don Bilau for his consultative support in this project and for all the experience he brings in equipping us for helping youth to thrive. Join me in welcoming Dr. Bilau. He serves as a school psychologist and has extensive experience in working with children and adolescents. And we are so pleased he can share this content with you today. Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate the opportunity to address all those in attendance regarding the critical issue of helping our children and youth move through their phases of life when certainly when they're confronted with different crises that they may experience. Certainly, it appears that our children and youth today are confronted with more and more demands, and they are challenged to be a child and a teenager in the times that we're dealing with today. So today we're going to be talking about specifically what we call the tweenager, if you will, preteen kind of an age where those children are at risk to experience a variety of different challenges. So as Chris mentioned, the Four Corners area has been, as I see it, leaders in the development of providing preventive measures of strategies and skills that us as adults can utilize to assist our children and youth. So as you can see on this next slide, that Chris and Sarah, among others, that make up her team, are leaders in this effort. And today, our objectives include these four key areas. We're going to be talking about some information that you have no doubt been exposed to in the past, and that may be a great review for you. On the other hand, we also may be talking about some techniques and skills that you can utilize that you've not perhaps have used for a period of time in connecting with our tweens, if you will. And we'll also be talking a little bit about some techniques that we can share with parents to provide them support as they're working with and dealing with their children who engage in behavioral issues, not only in the school setting, but also the community setting. And ultimately, a constant theme with all of our work with Four Corners during the past 2 or 3 years has been, we need to be concerned about safety and be able to identify some possible suicide risk factors that we can respond to as adults, particularly with our tweens, if you will. So what is a tweenager? Well, as a quick review, some of the ideas are that children reach these tween years somewhere around 8 to 12 years old. It can range, it can vary. It can, some of our children show signs as early as 8 years. Some tweens may be in this stage until they're 13 years old. And to some extent, I think some of us adults sometimes get stuck in being a tween ourselves. Not that we'll be willing to admit that. But so what are those tween characteristics? Well, as our children grow and mature and as their brains neurologically change, the tweens start to care a lot about what other thinks about them. That means they really want to try to fit in. They really want to fit in, and they start feeling remorse and be feeling bad if they're left out of activities with their peers. They start experiencing a sense of anxiety, if you will. It starts emerging. They may not be able to identify what that feeling is by name, but they know they're feeling uncomfortable, particularly start comparing themselves to their friends and their perceptions of what they think their friends should be experiencing. And we need to remember that even confident children can become insecure and highly sensitive at this particular age. In my work as a school psychologist, as well as a mental health therapist, this age is often found where our kids, when confronted with change in general, can become significantly insecure, and their behaviors begin speaking louder than words. So certainly, changes in behavior are characteristics that we need to be sensitive to. So the question becomes, are teenagers different today, here in 2024? Are they different from what they were 15, 20, 30 years ago developmentally? There's different perceptions in terms of that answer, but my sense is to tell you probably. They probably are different. They're different in a variety of different ways because their experiences are substantially different from what many of our preteens might have experienced in previous generations, if you will. Their vulnerability has increased, if you will, due to societal changes and influences that were not even thinkable 15, 20 years ago. So not only has their vulnerability increased due to the culture that they live in within their own families, but you're also exposed to bombardments of information that becomes overcoming when you think about the news, the daily newscasts on television, and the exposure to the violence that they are exposed to on a worldwide level as well as the national level. So certainly vulnerability is increased to being exposed to uncertainty, if you will. And as a consequence, their cognitive and social emotional developments are different, in my opinion. They're different as a result of these influences. Some schools of thought think that tweens development has changed, with many looking as if their cognitive development looks more like middle and late adolescence. Isn't that interesting to have that thought process that these kids might actually be functioning differently because neurocognitively that may be different as a result of those influences. And sometimes those influences do not allow the tweenager, if you will, to engage in developmentally normal activities, what we think might have been developmentally normal a few generations ago, such as play and pretend play, if you will, because certainly teenagers in past generations had experienced that. So certainly we need to kind of think of our tweens today from that perspective, that they may not be like the tweens that we knew of a generation or two ago. So what might be a crisis for these tweens today? What might that look like? So I think it's important to kind of think about what a crisis might look like from their perceptions, if you will, but also keep in mind developmental approaches and how developmentally they may have changed, if you will. So we'll circle back to that idea in just a few minutes. But what is a crisis? A crisis, not necessarily a traumatic situation event, but a reaction, a tween's reaction or teen's reaction or response to an event. One teen or tween might be deeply affected by something, while another suffers little or no ill effects. A crisis presents an obstacle, trauma, or threat, but it can also present an opportunity for growth. I think us as adults can acknowledge that and be able to create a process of responding that looks at the idea as an opportunity for that child's development and growth. Predicaments can certainly present opportunities for that teen or tweenager, if you will. And I think our responsibility as an adult is to look at that predicament that tween might see themselves experiencing and view it as an opportunity for growth and development, and think responsibly as an adult, some preventive measures, some teaching opportunities. There's an old saying that says that in order to first teach a child, you must first train a child. And that's, I think, is particularly true in terms of thinking about how to prepare and to teach a teenager what the various responses could be to a particular crisis response that they're exhibiting at that moment. But remember, for that teenager, that crisis can be totally different from one to another. But those typical crises, if you will, they, as I mentioned, they show those behaviors, those various problematic behaviors. And here again is a generational difference. Cravings to use social media. I assure you that our teenagers are very aware of social media, their use of phones, and they may have this preoccupation, this compulsion to turn to that media for some type of insight, some type of reinforcement, some type of connecting, if you will. And sometimes these tweens will engage in or find it difficult to stop using social media and engage in other behaviors such as lying or sneaking around in order to use those devices when they're not allowed. I often call sometimes this behavior as being confabulation, where they may engage in some type of sharing of information that about a particular situation that is beyond expectations. In other words, they will exaggerate a response. Why did you do this? What made you do this? We as adults might ask, and we might hear this extensive story to defend their actions, made up of different pieces of what I call confabulation, as a attempt to describe the reasons for their engagement in those type of behaviors. I mentioned this before, something called what I call FOMO, fear of missing out. That can certainly prompt a crisis with a teenager, if you will. And sometimes those behaviors will engage in screaming, punching something, throwing something. And so that's a crisis behavior that teenagers will exhibit. They might also experience suicidal ideations, significant depression, and they may experience of being bullied, as well as engaging in bullying behaviors themselves, because oftentimes they're modeling behaviors that adults may have exhibited within their family structure, or perhaps an older sibling has exhibited that behavior directed towards them, and they will then engage in that type of behavior themselves. As adults, I think it's useful for us to, when we're exploring the reasons or the possible influences of a teenager who's engaging in behavioral crises, it's important to get some sense in terms of what modeling behavior there might have been that might have led to that specific behavior. With that, you learn a key. You learn a key to that particular influence or set of influences that has perhaps influenced that tween to engage in that type of behaviors. Being in fight or flight mode, that's common with teenagers, if you will, if confronted with something that is beyond their willingness or beyond their ability to accept or to engage in. The typical tween crises, if there is such a thing, engages, you might find tween girls presenting crises as a result of high levels of stress, self-doubt, sadness, and insecurity. They've been typically reported by much older girls in the past. So now we see this dropping, you see, in terms of that, what we might have see common with our 16, 17-year-old girls, we're now starting to see more common within our 11-year-old girls, our 12-year-old girls within that middle school, late elementary setting, which is a unique kind of movement. And I think most of our elementary schools and our middle school settings will agree with that statement, that we're seeing a higher frequency of this type of, well, as the girls will say, drama. Drama becomes very intense. The bullet at the bottom of the slide talks about a study that identified that only 68% of fifth grade girls in 2017, which is several years ago, described themselves as being confident. Actually, let me strike that. Actually, it was a 2023 survey compared to 86% in 2017. That's 5 to 6 year difference is alarming. It tells us, I think, in volumes that this is a significant issue. That is, the data does support that we need to be attentive to as adults. That this is a trend that that certainly we need to be thinking about in terms of vulnerability that these girls experience, and think about ways to go upstream, if you will, in terms of what can we do as adults to promote the more positive coping skills, promote more open communication, be able to help identify what some of those influences that the individual girl or the group of girls might be experiencing. As a school psychologist, I work with both fifth, sixth, seventh grade girls significantly, and certainly their drive to be like everyone else in their group is high, but also their hypersensitive to any type of conclusion that they're not like others. Again, that slide previously, I talked about that high need to be involved, accepted, is something that we need to be, as adults, attentive to. Other crises that tweens can confront include and not limited to experiences that drive depression and sometimes panic, if you will. I have found in the last couple of years that a number of tweens that I have worked with have experienced homelessness, or the threat of homelessness due to economic challenges within their families. And certainly that lends itself to insecurity and lends itself to anxiety, fear that is echoed within a family unit and is reflected as well. The death of a family member or friend can also be a crisis that tweens find it difficult to verbalize, to process, to be able to identify a positive or an appropriate response. I've worked with a number of tweens within the last 4 to 5 years who have unfortunately experienced some type of traumatic loss, including suicide loss. And certainly that has impacted their emotional development. It's impacted their ability to manage their emotions. And what I have found within a couple of tweens that I've worked with, that loss may have been 2 or 3 years previously, perhaps when that child was in 3rd grade. But now in 5th and 6th grade, the loss is becoming more meaningful to them. They're now more in a position that perhaps neurologically they can find the words to express their grief rather than actions. So certainly at the same time, you may see both taking place, where suddenly that child may have been relatively quiet, if you will, for a number of years after adverse traumatic loss, but now emerging in the 5th and 6th grade, they find actions as well as words starting to come together to reflect that sense of loss. And they may not themselves have been able to identify how that loss impacted them until we start processing with them what that might mean to them. Other crises that tweens may experience is they may have thoughts of ending their lives. They're not sure how to keep themselves safe within a school environment where they might see themselves as being potentially bullied, if you will, or they might be seeing things or hearing things that are frightening to them and that no one else hears or sees. So tweens can certainly experience different types of crises. As you can see on this slide, loss and being in life-threatening situations can certainly lend itself. What does it mean to them? Oftentimes just feeling overwhelmed. They have these intense emotions and are unable to communicate what that means to them. They're struggling with different thoughts, if you will. So I ask you, as you kind of listen to this process, feel free to put questions or comments in the chat. So hopefully we can attend to those later.
Already out.
So we talked about experiences that can influence a tweenager, and certainly it's worthy of talking about ACEs for a minute or two, neurocognitive differences, certainly COVID-19, social media, social school inhibitions. So we're just going to touch on these possible experiences that influence a teenager. And if you remember ACEs, ACEs are essentially adverse child experiences, if you will. And the 4 common types of adverse child experiences include physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect. In my work with tweens who I identify being at risk, I would say nearly 80-90% of the children that I have worked with through the years certainly have some type of ACE experience, if you will. And certainly we need to remember that these experiences can lead to toxic stress that impacts their thought process, their neurocognitive development, which oftentimes we don't, perhaps as adults, attend to as much as we should. We're certainly familiar with trauma and trauma care, and we're certainly aware of the importance of being trauma sensitive, and certainly those children who experience ACEs, we need to, as adults, to be able to connect with them. And that's what today's work's going to be, is talking about skills and techniques here in a few moments that I personally have utilized to work with children or tweens, if you will, and to help connect. Because at the end of the day, connecting with our teenagers is extraordinarily important. And without the ability to connect with our teenagers, they develop a sense of being isolated, being alone on an island, if you will. Because at the end of the day, oftentimes parents are the last individuals that teenagers are going to connect with for a couple of reasons. One of them is they don't want to be a burden. They don't want to add to whatever discomfort or distress that they sense within that family unit. So us as adults within the school setting and within the mental health setting, it's really upon us to really work hard to make connections in a non-judgmental way and be able to connect and be appreciative of the exposures, for example, that these children have experienced. Because from a neuroemotional development perspective, again, those influences are substantially different, if you will, than what other generations have experienced, because the number of ACEs that these current children have experienced is dramatically different than other generations. And there was something called COVID-19 that made a significant difference in terms of academic development as well as social skill development, particularly for our current tweenagers, if you will, those fifth, sixth graders, and perhaps some of those seventh graders as well, has made a significant impact upon those areas, if you will. And in order to cope with some of those differences, if you will, social media has emerged for our teenagers as a way to connect, to try to sort things out and figure things out. And certainly the information they receive may not be necessarily wholesome and positive in terms of development. That's where it's important for us as adults to really strive for connections. Connections are healing, being given the time to connect with a child. And we'll talk about a few techniques. And I'm sure there are others that you may have as well. I ask you to share in the chat box as we go along to help build those connections. So I think it's important to us to remember that teenager brain is evolving, and in ways that makes kids more sensitive to their own emotions and to those of others. But at the same time, they develop this heightened reactivity to emotion. And so their neurological development may well be lagging in a variety of areas that's active in regulating emotions or self-control. So how do we help with that? Well, so we'll deal with that in a couple minutes. But there's a lot of different ways to look at children's and teenagers' development, if you will. So one of the more time-honored perceptions have been around for many, many years is Piaget's theory of cognitive development. And I still think it's that Piaget's development, and as I mentioned, just one of many different perceptions, if you will, for children. I think it gives us some basic good neurological guidelines in terms of helping understanding where our teenagers could be and perhaps where they should be in terms of their neurological development or experience. And if you look at the bottom of the page, age 11 and up, you can see theoretically we should be able to see most of our children being able to process information that they're allowed to take a look at. So certainly I think it's kind of useful to kind of remember that some of those guidelines. And Piaget talks about that formal operational stage we saw a minute ago, and that early at 7 to 11 kind of a thing, is that they're starting to become more thinking, more independent, and certainly our pre-adolescents and adolescents, they start being able to understand abstract concepts. But the key is that connection again. So what you see on this slide is something that I borrowed from a couple of different places, but it kind of looks at the idea of that teenager when they move into a crisis response mode. Now, if you see the trigger, you see the calm, if you know the pre-crisis, if you will, the trigger, whatever that might be. She said this to me, he did this, I feel left out, somebody looked at me wrong, if you will, that they move to agitation, something adds into acceleration, reaches peak of crisis exhibition in terms of behavior, words, if you will, withdrawal, running away, whatever the behavior might be. And then we see the de-escalation and hopefully move towards recovery process. Of course, what we really want to see with us working with children who repeatedly engage in this sort of crisis response, we want to go upstream as much as possible, engage in that trigger, if you will, help our children learn how to cope with triggers and be able to avoid moving up rapidly to this thunderstorm and then moving forward. But on the other hand, that this de-escalation, that recovery, if you will, turn the light bulb on, that's where we as adults can use a variety of techniques to process and to connect and build trust. One of the things I see about our teenagers who are often in crisis are our children or who are unable to have a trusting relationship with an adult. As I mentioned before, that sense of being a burden, a fear of adding to discomfort is something that we need to kind of acknowledge, that not only towards parent figures, but they might have some degree of that sort of thinking process connected to us as adults. I mentioned COVID-19, if you will, and the impact of COVID-19. Social media, we've talked about a bit already. And certainly tweens are showing more and more inclination to be on social media through their phones, if you will. Cyberbullying is becoming more and more commonplace with teenagers, if you will. Certainly, the research is clearly showing that more time you spend, the greater the risk of increasing anxiety, despair, being unable to find a way to find a meaningful way to cope with this. I think what's interesting on this particular slide is something that we as adults may not necessarily be sensitive to, is that search engines and social media algorithms can intentionally expose youth to cyber hate, racism, and sexism. I think that's interesting. I think it's frightening that the research and is showing that the evidence is developed that youth are exposed to these sort of filters are at increased risk of next day depression and anxiety symptoms. Isn't that significant? Our teenagers who are so subtle to influences and they're so turned into and glued into their social media, they're highly vulnerable to these type of experiences, these negative experiences. So certainly the risk of social media are especially acute or high, if you will, during early adolescence or teenagers when all these changes are going through with them. One wonders, why is that? Why is it that these algorithms are intentionally creating that? And honestly, I don't have a clear answer to you other than my suspicion. It has something to do with marketing and money. But if you look at the girls, if you will, again, back to that 2023 Girls Index survey, if you will, 95% of the 5th and 6th grade girls, 99% of the high school girls use social media. And so the conclusion is that the girls who spend most time on social media are more likely to dislike their appearance and more likely to want to change how they look and are least likely to describe themselves as confident. So without question. There's accepting help for a teenager. I think it's useful for us to remind ourselves of the fact there is stigma associated, even with a teenager, to accept help from an adult, such as a counselor, school counselor, any adult, for a variety of reasons. The family themselves may have embedded within that teenager a sense that we want to be careful about trusting others outside the family. There's developmental differences, certainly, that impact that as well in terms of barriers to accepting help and, again, skills. Many teenagers I have found through the years are highly skilled at confabulation and minimizing their own accountability. And that's a symptom of the lack of trust. It's a symptom of this has been a coping skill that perhaps they have learned to utilize, and that we as adults can certainly spotlight and teach the value of using other skills other than those particular negative coping skills. We'll talk for a bit about connecting and building resiliency. And I think what we can do as adults is to constantly keep in mind the need that we have to clarify how the tween is feeling and to check our understanding and to really focus on what your perspectives are. It's important that we create a judgment-free zone and not minimize their experience that they're having at that moment. One of the challenges I think we have as adults is that at times we will be involved with something else. We unintentionally may have our attention focused on something different, which a teenager will interpret as a lack of care. So the key to supporting a tween in crisis is really perceptive communication. It's different. I see that different than just communication. Perceptive means really perceiving and trying to connect with that tween in a supportive manner. And that way we can start becoming aware of the positive influences. That allows us then to encourage that teenager to be able to cope and survive and thrive with the different confrontations or crises they may be exposed to, because that allows us to build a bridge. I think with teenagers, we're constantly building bridges and using a feelings wheel, which is something similar to what I use with our teenagers. It helps me develop a bridge. And by simply using a simple little feelings wheel, which is very rudimentary, and there's hundreds of other ways to do that, but try to identify what that teenager is feeling at that moment as we go forward. So, and I would use a feelings wheel often within a 30 to 30-minute session with a teenager. By the way, most of my sessions with tweens, and even in crisis, if you will tend to be 30 to minutes. Not likely going to be more than that, not likely going to be less than that. For the teenager, I can build a bridge, connect. I don't want them to feel uncomfortable. I want them to be able to feel like they're trusted and they're a partner in terms of taking a look at that experience they're confronting. So I like to use what I would call the powers of play, if you will. Play is excellent at being able to build communication. And so with some of our teenagers in crisis, I will engage in a play activity of some sort as a means to de-escalate, maybe as a means to redirect, or a means of building rapport. There's a variety of different ways to utilize play to build communication. You got to remember, school counselors do not provide therapy or long-term counseling in schools, but that doesn't mean that we can't engage in some type of relationship building. As a mental health therapist, I certainly can use play therapy and do use play therapy to deal with a variety of different experiences. But I think within a school setting, our school counselors certainly can use techniques to build communication platforms. So examples of play to deal with help working with teenagers immediately after a crisis or on a process of building rapport. I think of board games, card games, playing catch, swinging on swings. During if you have a swing opportunity or gym, you can go walk, and to just play some sort of experience, I think is pretty useful. One of the little play games that I have used with the preteens quite a bit is certainly Simon Says. I've also although may seem, you may, oh gee, that's something for like early elementary. It turns out the teenagers get their permission to do something really simple like this, helps kind of break the monotony, break the routine. And with some teenagers, particularly boys, I will allow them to engage in building Legos, building a Lego model of some sort. So I frankly, in my briefcase, I have a set of a Lego platform and probably I don't know, probably 50 different pieces of Legos, and I'll bring them on the table and we'll sit and I'll say, let's spend some time together. I'd like to have you build something, whatever you want to build. And so they'll start working on whatever comes to their mind. and then we'll start chatting about the experience that they've had during that day, or that loss they may have had a year ago, the challenge they're having with being bullied. And so it becomes a vehicle, if you will. So I see play as being a very effective vehicle. Another vehicle I think is extremely useful is what I call side-by-side art. I want to guarantee you I am not an artist. I struggle with stick people. But certainly side-by-side drawing I found through the years with a teenager really gives us an opportunity to connect. And so they will draw whatever they wish to draw. They may copy something. They may even do mazes, if you will, side by side. It's really helpful to be able to give us a medium to connect. I often like to use something called a kinetic family drawing, where I ask a teenager to draw out tell me who's at home, and let's identify who lives at home. And I will say, encourage your pets. I want to tell you, sometimes I'll get 7 different pets included in the family drawing, and it builds communication between myself and the teenager by identifying who is who's meaningful, and what is a relationship they may have with that particular individual. And that helps be able to provide that teenager an opportunity to process. I also have been use this technique quite often, where I will ask the teenager to tell me a story. Let's make up a story in the next couple 3 minutes. Could be a fairy tale, if you will, or it could be some kind of a make-believe story. Or I'll ask that student to identify a favorite book and to read it with me or to me. And I will use humor in terms of this storytelling experience. How long does this take? Maybe 5 to 7 minutes. I think any type of intervention that I may utilize, I would encourage it to be something that's focused, engaging, and that you be able to utilize that again to make that connection. So what we're doing then as we move forward, we're finding different ways to develop rapport, being non-judgmental, to encourage that communication. Now, if you remember, we want to identify ways and methods to help that youth, that child, that tween, to cope with adversity, to cope with a challenge that's difficult for them to respond to. And for some of our teenagers who are perhaps challenged because of a variety of neurodevelopmental influences, such as autism or ADHD, these techniques are extremely helpful, because one of the keys in terms of helping teenagers is for us to connect and help them process information and to identify different techniques that they can practice with us is to be able to use these various techniques to connect. I have found through the years that particularly with children who are experiencing the influence of autism or ADHD, these techniques are extraordinarily meaningful. Another technique that I will utilize, and I think we all could consider, is the use of music. And one can ask a teenager, and they can certainly tell you oftentimes what are their favorite music, what do they like to listen to. Now, I have learned through the years that there are some music is highly reinforcement of their negative emotions or negative behaviors. So I think it's useful for us to identify what they're listening to and help process what that might mean to them. So again, we're kind of pause for reflection, again, put some things in the chat box, if you will. So our crisis response. So what do we do? Back to that absolute crisis response. I think it's useful for us to consider the possibility within the school setting and as well as the community setting for mental health therapists to to think about developing a crisis response plan that is simple, straightforward, and one that can be embraced by parents as well as school counselors and whoever's working with that particular teenager. I think for the parents, it's important for us to ask the parents, these questions. Is your child at risk of harming themselves or others? And they may say, no, I don't think that's the case. It gives us an opportunity to begin communicating. Or they may say just the opposite. Oh, yes, I'm frightened. I've done all these various precautions. And then that gives us a little information how to help support them as well. Are they expecting a situation that could cause lasting harm to the child's physical or emotional well-being? Is your child's crisis impacting other members of your family? It's a critical question. And certainly this is something for the parents to consider to help them think about a safety plan, if you will. And are the children engaging in some type of negative coping behaviors? Are there negative behaviors interfering with them performing their daily functions at home or at school? So I think when we're working with parents or kids or teenagers showing some issues at school, I think we should also be prepared as adults to ask questions, these difficult questions, to help engage them as a partner. So I think for our parents, when we're connecting with them, I think it's important that we encourage them to help the tween feel safe, to strive for that magic ratio. And that magic ratio really is at least 5 positive interactions for every negative one for your teenager. That's a great formula. It's meaningful, and it helps the parent think about that. I think we can say the same thing in the school setting too, when we as administrators or school counselors, that we strive to have positive interactions for every negative issue that is reported to us that we're working with. Communicate non-judgmentally. Don't be afraid to ask the hard questions to your teenager. We need to encourage our tweens to be empowered, and we need to remind our parents healing after a crisis or multiple crises takes time, and recovery is not a one-shot linear experience. So we might answer, what is a crisis response plan? Why should we have one? So essentially, a crisis response plan, there's a lot of different forms. But one example is that you simply identify the reason, you identify the history, you try to identify the triggers, and you identify what's been used in the past. So I think what we're able to do with working with parents and other staff, we develop a crisis response plan. We're trying to identify some skills that we can teach, or some environmental changes that can be put in place to help minimize the risk of a crisis reoccurring as a result of interactions between that teenager, other teenagers, or other crisis situations that could be in a school setting, or even whether they be structured or unstructured settings. I think you'll find that in a school setting, probably at least half, maybe a bit more, crises take place in unstructured settings, in free time, lunchrooms, playgrounds, hall passing, if you will. And so I think we need to be thinking about safety plans or crisis response plans for our teenagers, particularly in those vulnerable time periods when we see them at a greater risk to experience or exhibit those type of behaviors. And this kind of says a little bit more about that. So when we're actually confronted at the time with a tween engaging in a crisis-related behavior, couple of things that I think us within the school setting are trained in, but just a quick reminder: use the name of the student who is exhibiting the crisis behavior. If possible, remove any audience from the area. Speak in a slow, steady voice. Listen. I have to emphasize that is so important. Slow, steady voice. Don't give too much information. Be clear. Your voice is calming. Your tone calms that student. They're listening to you, even in a state of crisis when they're exhibiting a high octave, if you will, of verbalizations. That is one of the keys that we have to neutralize and to reduce that emotional crisis, behavior crisis. Double your distance as well as along making sure everyone's safety is assured, so that we want to engage in keeping that child and others safe. If that tween is considering self-harm or suicide, I think we need to certainly move quickly to contact mental health providers, if need be, emergency room. And I'm going to share with you the Columbia suicide screening instrument, which really helps clarify risk that you can utilize. We'll see it in just a minute. Consider using the 988 and the Suicide Crisis Lifeline or local crisis response number. Have that information available on your desk, have it available in your wallet, whatever, so you can pull it out, be able to have access to that information right away. And then always in a case of imminent danger, contact law enforcement, and they will be able to respond to provide safety to all of that's involved, whether it's in the family setting, in the community, or within the school setting as well. Here's what the Columbia screening instrument is. It has these key questions. I encourage you to make a note as to what those are. It helps you give guidelines, helps you give information that you can share with the emergency room or mental health provider to help identify next steps to move to maintain safety of that teenager. One thing I want to say to you, that teenagers have the tendency to have repetitive crises. How about that? Teenagers will whether they're individuals have had experienced a history of trauma, ACEs, all those sort of influences we talked about, they maybe more likely than others to experience some type of reoccurrence of crises. But teenagers will certainly have that tendency to experience repetitive crises. The good news is they're able to learn, particularly to learn different skills, different thought processes that allows them to develop emotional self-control as time goes on with positive reinforcement. One of the keys that I utilize with teenagers and teens in general, from a school psychology as well as psychologist, as well as a licensed mental health clinician perspective, is I like to use specifically a problem-solving skill called SOTAS. And that SOTAS is an acronym that I work through with teenagers in particular when they experience some type of behavioral crisis that has caused them to be referred to me for stabilization or for processing that particular event. SOTA stands for situation, what the S stands for, if you will, options, whether they be positive or negative options, because any type of options are identified. And a teenager will oftentimes come up with at least one or two options, if you will. Then we go into processing the disadvantages to any of those options that they have talked about already. And then we'll go in and talk about the advantages. And then we'll talk to, well, what would have been the S stands for solution, if you will, in the SOTAS model. What would that solution, what would have been a better solution next time there is a situation? How might I handle that? So it's a communication device. One of the keys I found with teenagers when using that specific type of intervention, whether it be a mental health professional or even the parents, because I encourage parents to consider using this as well, it may require numerous times of using a soda, if you will. I have an old rule that says sometimes you have to do this 11 times before we start seeing integration of that information that they have been identified. And teenagers don't necessarily enjoy going through that soda, if you will, but certainly going through it numerous times of different situations helps build communication, but also helps instill some degree of confidence that they're able to start identifying a different way of handling a situation. At the end of the day, it's about what we can do as adults to enhance confidence and resiliency for our teenagers to help them cope with a situation they may perceive as difficult or a crisis. And with that confidence, that reduces anxiety so that they can move forward. So we're rapidly coming to the conclusion of the time we have to share today. I can assure you that I commend all of you for attending this webinar and Four Corners for presenting this opportunity. This has been hopefully a good review for you and a good reinforcement for you that you are able to provide opportunities for teenagers to learn from their experiences, and with the support that we as adults can provide, they can find confidence and ways to manage themselves so that they can reduce the likelihood the crisis will escalate as they move forward. So I'll take just a couple of minutes and see if there are some questions in the chat that we might be able to address. I'll have to stay on for a few minutes to address some of those. So Sarah or Angel, can you assist with this particular part?
Sure. Yep, we sure can. And before people start hopping off, I do want to mention we want to give a big thank you to Dr. Belaw for this presentation today. And thank you to each and every one of you for joining us today. For attendance purposes, make sure that you have signed in on the Google Doc. That's how we're keeping track of who's here today. One CEU will be available to Nebraska licensed mental health counselors, school counselors, and school psychologists. Again, to be eligible for this CEU, you must have attended the entire webinar and complete an attestation of training form. So that and a certificate of attendance will be sent through email after the presentation. We will also be sending the slides as note pages. The recording will be posted on our YouTube page, which can be found, the link can be found in the chat. Please save the date. We have the next presentation in our Language Matters series. It will be done by Terry Eafley through Region 5 Systems. And the registration for that is in the chat. And our next in-person workshop focused on youth mental health and resiliency will be on March 22nd. So save that date as well. We'll take any questions for Don now. His email is on the screen and also in the chat if you have questions for him after the presentation too. So thanks again, everyone.
Thank you, Sarah. Again, for those who are LMHPs, I encourage you to complete the attestation so we can share with you the CEUs. This is the year for us LMHPs to be counting hours, so every hour counts, folks. And sir, I think most everybody has jumped off.
Yep, I'm not seeing any questions so far, but we'll stick on just in case.
Yeah,